Okay, I have the honor of introducing our third panelist and the final one for this session, Mark of Carr. And he is the Senior Director of Ethics for the Providence Healthcare Corporation in Alaska, where the mission is to extend the healing ministry of Christ, which guides the century and a half-vocation tradition of the Sisters of Providence. He formerly pastored several Seventh-day Adventist churches in Alaska. Prior to receiving his PhD in religious ethics at the University of Virginia, he devoted 16 years to Loma Linda University School of Religion, where he led the MA program in biomedical and clinical ethics, as well as being the theological co-director for the Center of Christian Bioethics. After a short time at Kettering College in Ohio, he returned to his beloved Alaska, where he enjoys his job now: family, flying, fishing, and fat tire biking in the mountains in winter. So, Mark.
Thank you, one and all. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank a colleague at work, James Terry. I want to thank an old friend, Kirby Oberg at Loma Linda University, for their help with this paper. I think it's worth noting that this is Transgender Awareness Week, and that on the 20th is Transgender Day of Remembrance, a need to remember those persons who were killed over the last year because of gender bias. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm an ethicist, a bioethicist, which means occasionally I'm a gadfly. In this paper, I'm going to share some of my thoughts on human nature, particularly as it focuses on non-binary persons, intimacy, and how Adventism positions itself regarding such persons. I am not going to attempt to try to clarify the terms and the field. I know that I will make category mistakes and terminological mistakes, and I stand ready to be schooled. Happy to be schooled. So I'm not going to try to clarify all the terms and categories. I'm not going to focus on gender dysphoria. I'm not going to focus on the psychosocial cultural issues at play here, because those are rich and many. And I'm not going to focus on it. I will assert that intimacy, up to and perhaps including sexual intimacy, is essential to our human nature. Unfortunately, Adventism, as expressed through the official statement Transgenderism and others, cannot conceive of such intimacy for non-binary persons living together in fidelity who wish to be members of the church. Secondly, I'll look briefly at this and other positions of the Adventist Church as they influence Adventist healthcare corporations in the United States in particular. And I'll assert that our church's healthcare ministry fails to live out Christ's altruism to our communities in favor of protecting our relationship with the church. It's self-protection, it's egoism, and ironically, it falls under the shelter of the United States laws on religious liberty. Laws that look like establishment to some legal scholars. I won't go into it, but I think it's important to mention. And this imbalance really in our healthcare ministry ought to come to an end. All right, part one on human nature. I think speaking out of philosophical society as an ethicist on the topic of human nature is a fool's errand. Nonetheless, here I go. I position myself really in the stream of neo-Aristotelianism. I'm going to do my best to scan through and highlight areas of the paper. You've got it in front of you as well. I take a both and approach, or as my colleague Jerry Winslow would often say, I'm a lumper, not a splitter. A both and approach. So a materialistic perspective on human nature, absolutely. A non-materialistic perspective on human nature? Absolutely. The two must be blended together. As Jaeger and Stroll note in their article, I think I'm on page 4 now, as far as human beings are concerned, the relation between nature and culture is mutually constitutive. To oppose one to the other is incomprehensible. Everything that we are and do is revealed as simultaneously cultural and natural. Another way of looking at this complexity is referred to by Neil roughly as developmental plasticity. Human development, roughly says, is partially established at birth, only partially. The prolonged infant helplessness of human children requires a social uterus, a secondary altriciality. As anthropologist Montague once put it, there's an exterogestation involved in human development, since the human brain at birth is only 30% there. It still has 70% left before full functionality. This level of complexity layered on top of human genetic science and complexity regarding gender and sexuality in particular should prompt humility on the part of our faith community reflections. All right, so a neo-Aristotelian. I think that there is good reason to think that some streams of Adventism can embrace a kind of neo-Aristotelianism through our sense of holistic persons having a well-being, a sense of thriving in life. Jesus came to offer life more abundantly. And I think that's part of how we can embrace some elements of Aristotelianism. Much of Aristotelian must be put off and rejected, as is true of our Adventism. So what can we learn on the physical side of the both and? This chart helped me dramatically thinking about human nature. It's a horrible, horrible slide, right? It's way too small, but you have it there in the paper on the site, and you can zoom it up until it's massive. Let me just highlight a couple things. It's linear this way. That says conception, birth, and puberty, all right? It's vertical this way, whatever XX is. I left off science a long time ago. I think, is that women or men? I always get confused. Female. All right, so this side is female. This side is male. What are all these things in between? We used to call them mutations. Mutations. These are known genetic patterns of the human being. By estimates, 139 million people in the world today are in these known genetic patterns. What do we do when our church says, you're either or there? Well, my colleague at Loma Linda, Kirby Oberg, is a specialist in this stuff. We've been talking about this slide for years now. He studies the first cellular divisions of the human person. He's confirmed the legitimacy of this chart. You can see it in the source. You can find it on the web. It's easy enough to do so. Scientific American 2017. In conversation with him about this chart, he's confirmed its legitimacy and noted that development of gender is necessarily tied to our genotype. Okay, so phenotypically that way, genotypically this way. And if you want to get from whatever this one is over to this side, follow the arrows and you can see what you can do in order to face the world as a female, perform as a female. One of these is called Klinefelter syndrome. Perhaps you've heard of that one. How do we adjust this person along this way so that they live that way? Or maybe we just let them be. Must? Whose moral burden is it that they turn out this way or that way? Well, while I would assert in this complex process, in light of this slide, that human sexuality and gender is fluid, not fixed, Dr. Oberg would politely tell me that I'm engaging in an overemphasis of the data. Rather, he would say that we humans can be fluid. I quote him, and he allowed me to do so, because 90 to 95% of us are relatively binary in our biological sex, maybe a bit more fluid in our gender identity. End quote. With this understanding of human development, he asserts that there are hormonal thresholds to cross as embryos develop that toggle in between male and female. At the intersection, these are his words again, at the intersection, there's room for some 5 to 10% that are ambiguous or fluid. Another quote from another theologian there. I want to quickly go through in your paper. You'll see also a chart from Dr. Ness at PUC, Brian Ness, about the complexities when you add then other categories as well, which just increase the complexity of it. Now down to page 9. What I'm interested here is to try to establish a grace-oriented manner with which we Adventists can approach non-binary persons, intersex persons, as beautiful creations of our loving God. Persons whose genotype and phenotype, with resultant expression and intimate relationships, has nothing to do with church membership or God's gift of salvation. I agree with Lynn Marie Tonstad when she pushes Christians to take our claims of God's love more seriously. She writes, the whole social order that separates people into the decent and the indecent, that regulates accepted orders of bodily and economic exchange, is ruptured by a Christ who gave his life for all, but most particularly the despised, the marginalized, the monsters. Jasper, to your point. I'll say more about that from an author named Leah Devon, I think is the way she pronounces her name. I'm interested in our church embracing, as Tonstad notes, a model of loving exchange, free gift giving, and indiscriminate distribution, reflecting the economy of God, who distributes God's self among all people without reservation. All right, I will skip down to the assertion part of this first section of the paper. Asserting the obvious, page 13, lower part of the page. First, theologically, if we can say that God reflects the full female-male gender spectrum, and also say that God created humankind in God's image, then it strikes me as odd that we persist in limiting our view of human well-being through the gendered categories of male and female. Devon notes in her historical survey of Christian commentary on Adam that for some readers, Adam's maleness was inherently joined with femaleness. Some went so far as to claim Adam himself, and she's highlighting Christian commentary through the centuries, some went so far as to claim Adam himself as an androgen or a man-woman. Through this creation story, the concept of primal androgyny entered Christian theology during the first decades of the 3rd century. And according to Devon, certain Christian theologians at that time described Adam as sexually undifferentiated, the lost prototype of human nature that reflected divine innocence and simplicity. In similarly convincing fashion, Devon offers an historical material in support of the view that Jesus is androgynous. In a chapter on the alchemical tradition of the late Middle Ages, she notes that the portrayer, the artistic portrayal of Jesus as a person incorporating the whole of the female-male spectrum is throughout of the centuries. You can see this through the art that she shares in her text. According to this view, I'm quoting her, Christ is the ultimate non-binary figure, a unity of contrary parts, the human and the divine, the male and female. Christ in his life is both nature and supernature, male and female, human and divine, the poles of the spectrum tethered together, an eminently desirable union of opposites that transcends the normal operations of nature. And as Lynn Marie Tonstad puts it, Christians believe in a God whose love undoes every bind. I also assert that intimacy is an essential part of our human nature. I go on here to highlight the fact that in Adventist theology and commentary on the biblical portrayal of the human experience at creation, there's a very strong sense in the position statements that the whole purpose of a binary was for reproduction, a complementarity. There's this framing of complementarity. And Devon and others, it's not new thought, I want to argue complementarity and any reproduction that may have happened as a result of that is secondary to the creation of Eve. Eve was created for and because of Adam's loneliness and the relationship, the intimate relationship that Adam needed, that God's creation needed, that it, as some theologians are quick to help us understand, was present in God's self prior to the creation. So why wouldn't we as a church that believes in wholeness of life, a holistic theology, say that's more important, or the most important thing about the Genesis story? All right, time marches on. I want to go to the second part of the paper that focuses attention on Adventist healthcare ministry. Down to page 18. Adventist healthcare are not, the healthcare corporations, they're not owned by the church. We speak of Adventist healthcare corporations. There is formally, from the General Conference perspective, no such thing, even if we speak that way. Adventist healthcare corporations exist under the structure of American law, corporate law. General Conference gave up ownership of the healthcare institutions back in the late 80s, I think it was, for fear of the deep pocket and people suing us. Adventist healthcare corporations are licensed by state and federal entities to perform a service to the public. And in our effort to remain connected to our church, we partner with, that is, we Adventist corporations partner with the General Conference. And that's a beautiful thing. See it in Catholicism as well. It's the same thing. We can go ahead. Thank you. That partnership and the need to stay connected to the church results in self-protection and denial to the public of what the public expects from a publicly certified and licensed social institution, healthcare. And we're protected from not offering, and the three things that what that means is that we wanting to protect our connection to the administrative branch of the church, generally speaking, and this is true across the faith-based healthcare perspectives, at least three things are denied to the public in some way, shape, or form. Women's reproductive care, including abortion services, assisted death or assisted suicide, end of life care, including the assisted suicide. And the third thing is some element of transgender care, some 13 or so therapies that the public would expect a hospital to be able to offer. Now, not all hospitals have to offer every specialty, obviously. But when the healthcare systems face the public and say, we're here to extend the healing ministry of Christ, and we want you to come to us for that service. And then they come through the door and we say, oh, bless you, but we don't do that here. You'll have to go down the block. That necessary tension will eventually rupture the relationship with the church, formerly the administrative branch of the church. The exact same tension exists in the Catholic system, and it will eventually rupture those connections. Unless one or the other part caves a little bit, it's a problem. Let me say, finally, a couple things I want to assert at the end, and this will be the very conclusion. I highlight two times of apology, because what I'm suggesting is that the church's position towards intersex, non-binary persons, transgender persons is both embarrassing and will need to be apologized about. We will have to apologize at some point for this position we're taking. We did so once so far in our history. 100 years ago, we marginalized and pushed out German members of our church for holding to a nonviolence perspective. Pushed them out. And finally, the church offered an apology. The Catholic Church did it 396 years after they put Galileo under house arrest. Looking historically, if we fail, if we ignore our history, we will continue to have to apologize. So, final suggestions. First, please, some of you, let's do something to take a more aggressive, progressive effort to help the church with our biblical hermeneutics. One of the things I note in the paper is that the Genesis story in our official positions absolutely fixes all of our views about gender and sexuality to male and female, and intimacy can only be found in that structure. Male, female, male. We need more nuanced, sophisticated hermeneutics. Who among you will do that for us? Please. Really appreciate Christine Gudorf's chapter, 2010, book on sexuality and the sacred, her essay, The Erosion of Sexual Dimorphism. I'll be done in about 30 seconds. Religious communities should resist defining sexuality. In light of the complexity, the reality of the human person, and what it means to live well in intimate relationships with others, can we not be humble in the face of that reality and take more humble stances toward how persons live well with each other? It just strikes me we ought to be more anxious about the positions we've taken than we are. And so I think we should resist defining sexuality. Religious communities should decenter sexuality, particularly as intimacy is expressed through sexuality. We should decenter that. It's not unimportant, but it certainly doesn't have the importance that we seem to be focused on. Religious communities should historicize sexuality. Let's not pretend, try not to pretend that ideas of human intimacy have been somehow fixed since creation. This is where the book by Leah Devon, shucks, I'm not on the page, so I forget, the shape of sex, non-binary gender from Genesis to the Renaissance. And one of the things she notes there is that hermaphrodites, as was known then, or androgynous people, were considered monsters, Jasper, to your point. I don't know anything about monster theory, but what she demonstrates is that Christian societies classed intersex persons with monsters. The development of bestiaries in English society. Intersex, androgynous, hermaphrodite persons were classed among the monsters. That's our history. And to continue the kind of statements that our church is saying about, oh, come on, you can be with us, but no, you can't be a member, is to continue that tradition. It's unfortunate. We need to embrace and understand sexuality from a far more rich historical perspective than we presently seem to be. Finally, protect the weak without disempowering them. I would not identify intersex, transgender, non-binary persons as weak. Quite the contrary. They are frequently marginalized for no substantive reason. And I think this is particularly true in religious communities, including Seventh-day Adventists. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, we again have 12 minutes-ish for questions and comments. So let me start from the front this time.
Yeah, I was particularly struck, Mark, by your comment that religious communities must quit defining sexuality. And so I'll speak a little bit just as a pastor here, as I probably would have listened to my church members. And I can imagine saying something like that, and my church members saying, you know, you keep taking decisions away from us. We thought we knew how the world was created. Now you tell us it is that. As soon as science had an idea, then they said you're wrong. As soon as political entities or social entities or science has an idea about gender and sexuality, you say, well, that's not for you guys. You leave that alone. And the sort of, you're taking all the, you're letting us into only the gaps, and the gaps are filling up because you have all the answers already. And so I'm just trying to think about how my church members would have approached this. They would have said, we have been told that the Bible gives us answers to all questions. And now you're saying, no, that's not for you. No, that's not for you either. No, you leave that alone. Don't touch that. I understand the frustration.
Mm-hmm. Part of the reason why I would want scholars who are biblical scholars to do more for us than to simply say the Bible is there for you to interpret. You shouldn't need any help interpreting the Bible. In the fine, fancy word, hogwash. We all need help interpreting scripture. That's what the community faith is for. To imagine that an individual can sit down and understand scripture. Wasn't it the eunuch who said, boy, help me out here. I don't understand what's going on. So the reality of being a pastor and utilizing and embracing these statements from the church is excruciating.
It is.
And I've been using them in class and as a pastor myself in ways, and most of the time the church has no idea what the statements are saying. Didn't even know we were making it.
Yeah. And sometimes the statements are that we get from the top of the church are so partial as to, or so uninformed as to be a bit difficult to know what to do with anyway.
Unhelpful, as I said, embarrassing in this case.
Embarrassing.
I work with transgender persons, and the one I noted, my appreciation, James, has helped me with this paper, and I shared the statements with it. And it was embarrassing. to have a conversation with him afterwards about things my church has said. I deeply love this church. I want us to do better for, particularly in the application for healthcare, helping the public navigate these things. Church members, different focus. I'm now focused in healthcare. And I think if we think that to say we're extending the healing ministry of Christ and simply ignore and say you're either male or female, no, that's not helpful. Not at all. Abby, I think.
Yeah. I agree with you that our church needs to start thinking about this differently. And I think one of the things I think that would help is that guy's essay. Portman. Yeah, because he talks about the responsibility we have to wrestle with the text, right? It's in the tradition of Abraham, Moses, for the sake of justice. I mean, this is a very long-standing tradition which continues in the rabbinical writings, and we somehow lost it, right? And now we're becoming unjust because of that, right? So I really feel like if somehow we were taught or reminded that we were not just meant to read the text like Noah. We saw what happened when Noah just said, yes, Lord, you're going to destroy the world, no problem, right? No fighting back, the world was destroyed, right? So we have a responsibility, I believe, to wrestle with the text for the sake of justice, for the sake of the preservation of our lives as human beings. And I think to give this back to our church would help us to become more able to wrestle with the text. I don't mean changing the text. I don't like sometimes how the text, this is not important. I think the text should remain enshrined, but we need to wrestle with this text violently. The same thing with, for example, this idea that there will be people who will die at the end of times and we will be saved. Why are we not wrestling with that concept? Why is that so obvious?
Should cause a lot of anxiety.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way. I think that it's not you. Sorry. I think it would be great for his views to enter more into our community. And really, one more thing. I tell the kids that I teach, there's a difference between Christians and Jews when they address the scripture. Jews come in the scripture like they're at home. They come, they put their feet on the table, they open the fridge, they're at home and they can say, do it. Christians come, they're tiptoeing, they're so afraid, maybe God doesn't want me to say this, or I'm not allowed to, we need to become more at home.
Sure.
And wrestle with the text freely and not be afraid of wresting interpretations for the sake of justice. Yeah.
Without walking a full depth into the pool, if you will, of politics, I'm able to say what I've said in this paper in part because I work for a Catholic healthcare system. So who are the voices among us who have credibility among the church, in the church, and how can they wrestle with the text?
First, they have to have permission to do so.
And there is that. We face that.
We don't have.
And we might as well just be clear about that.
Yeah, totally.
Bonnie?
I agree. I thank you very much for your paper. It really means a lot to me right now. I just recently went back on the school board for the K-12 Academy in my town. And lo and behold, one of the first issues that happened at this school is this issue. And students wanted to start a Straight Alliance and all of that. And actually the administration was supportive and had people ready to go. Some parents got rather upset. But when they pulled the board together to talk about it, the educational secretary was saying, this is a conversation that is going on at every one of our Adventist academies. And I think that I am used to this conversation at healthcare, at colleges, at employment, over marriage. I'm not used to this conversation being about children. And when the conversation, I'm hopeful, because when the conversation changes to this is our children, this is us, the conversation will change. As long as the conversation is out there and we're interpreting texts for somebody out there, then we can take all kinds of positions because they don't touch us. As soon as it's our child, it will change. And the denominational position will change as the children change it. So I have great hope that the next generation changes this conversation for us and does it in a very organic kind of way.
I appreciate your optimism.
It's a hope.
Well, I think it's worthwhile recognizing that in the face of the alternatives, a naive optimism actually works all right. I would also note, however, that there have been at least 2 meetings that I'm aware of at the North American division level where scholars and experts on gender and sexuality were brought together by the church. Our colleague Kyoshin An pulled people together on one occasion. He's North American Division Secretary, I think. I had access to those papers and found them quite helpful, but they're not public. And again, going to the socio-political dynamic of our church, why is that? Because we're afraid of what one of us might say to ourselves. So I don't know what to do except to cling to my naive optimism in the light of that. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Help me understand if at all a positive understanding of communal celibacy would fit as a progressive category, or would that be too traditional of an understanding? Since that would be a more, I guess, next step before we would go into a more, completely affirmation. It's more like a intermediary possibility where the church really provides the intimacy for those individuals that may choose to have a traditional reading of sexuality or Matthew 19, things like that. So it does not fit in any way.
Well, I think so. I don't think there's any categorical reason or even conceptual reason that Aristotle's notion of living well would preclude being celibate. Not at all. And that's been true throughout history. But to make a position out of it, a formality out of it, saying this is the preferred way of life, it's a little bit like I always forget the term. Experiencing pain for salvific reasons. Yeah, but there's a Catholic category of theology that says we need to enter into Christ's pain to be vicarious suffering, or a kind of theological assertion that suffering is necessary for us. That's fine if I want to hold that position, but I can't impose that on a patient who's suffering and in need of pain medication and say, gosh, really the ideal way is for you to suffer for your Lord, and then he'll likely take you up, So no, I absolutely have no problem with celibacy, and that's where the church's positions presently are, particularly to homosexuality and to transgender and so on and so forth. But the statements are really interesting and well worth studying. For instance, from the Ethics Committee of the Biblical Research Institute, one of the reasons that they say transgender persons should not become married and experience a faithful, intimate relationship with the other, there might be a sophisticated desire for same-sex attraction. So you're going to go through surgery because you have a sophisticated desire to have sex with the same-sex person. Really? Jeepers, that seems like a reach to me. They're well worth reading, but they need help. Our church needs help, in my estimation. Yes,
I
sir.
don't want to cut you off, but we have 15 or so extra minutes. So this is just a time, maybe, I know there are lots of questions, or maybe questions for our other two presenters.
Sure.
So just, this is an open question time for either of our three presenters, so, yeah. Anyone?
Hans had his hand up
Yeah,
first.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark, for the call of renouncing to make definitions not only of sexuality, but about many other things. But I consider your recommendation as necessary, but as insufficient,
Mhm.
because the church is called also to give perspective, but perspective is not definition.
Yeah.
And the big mistake we have made, I think, concerning the Bible, is that we have made the Bible a book of specificities, it's not a book of perspective, as much as a constitution. A constitution is a big, because offers perspectives. For instance, the work is a value in a nation, but doesn't tell you the particular laws about it.
Mm.
You know? And the Bible is a big book for us, not for the specificities necessarily, but for the perspective, you know. So I agree with you with the call for avoiding making definitions. It complicates a lot of things. But the difficult task is uniting to this, you know, also the nation will give some perspective about the sexuality of many other things. So kind of just complementary work.
Mhm. I was the last recommendations from Gudorf in the article there. I struggled with whether or not to even use them, because I don't want to say, I don't think that the church should just stop speaking about sexuality and gender and so on. But at the same time, it would just be lovely to have it be more educated, more sophisticated, more in tune with the history of how Christianity has struggled with this in the past, and more humble in light of the complexity. And that complexity comes through science. One of the things I didn't have time to cover was the distinction, the way the administrative branch of the church looks at science compared to the healthcare branch of the church looking at science. And this is a framing category for me that I don't know if I've had the opportunity to tell you this on the side or what, but this is framing for me. When the church went through the fires at Battle Creek, the conservative, administrative, clerical branch of the church moved to the right coast. And the liberal medical branch of the church moved to the left coast. The left coast, the medical branch, is outward facing ministry to the public for their healthcare needs. The right coast, or the administrative branch of the church, is an inward facing protective measure for the church. And through that tension, our relationship with each other, the medical and administrative branch, will necessarily be contentious. I don't know how I got there from your question, but I think the reality is that we think differently. And I'm coming from an ethics, healthcare, outward-facing perspective that says, here's what we say we do for the public. And if that's really going to model the altruism of Christ, then we can't be bound by our self-concerned interest for staying connected with the administrative branch that doesn't want us to do some of these things.
Yeah, my point was, yes, that definition is univocal, and perspective is plurivocal. For this only the main difference, I think.
Thank you, Hans. Either Jim, but there may be questions for other speakers. I don't want to. Zach.
Thank you, Mark. I'm wondering whether, with Bonnie's optimism, I'm a little bit struggling with that, is they look not only at our church and the statements and the movement of statements, because we've had movement. We had abortion statement, and then we had a new abortion statement. And I'm comparing that to the way the Supreme Court works. You know, you can actually create a number of people that will get on the Supreme Court. You could change even Roe versus Wade, and you can do all kinds of things that are in the direction that does not seem to me very progressive, but regressive at times. And so I'm just wondering whether that's the issue, just not of what the church makes a statement on, but how are we positioning the leadership people that are actually having power and are creating people and movement to change and shape and reshape in a different direction that is not as positively looked at, you know, because if we will take Bonnie's kind of wonderful optimistic statement, we have been at many of those issues and statements in ethics, in bioethics, on human nature, on LGBT, in one direction, and then suddenly there is this retreat and going the opposite direction. It looks to me like it's a societal issue as well, as we kind of look at the world in which we live.
Yeah. And I don't want to bury my head to that. I didn't want to dig into this socio-political dynamic in the paper because I wanted to try to focus a bit more on the genotype, phenotype, and giving space, if you will, for the other rather than simply marginalizing. To your point, the new abortion statement did not come from the healthcare ministry part of the church. It is a socio-political response of the conservative administrative culture of the church. Pure and simple. Nobody that I'm aware of from the Adventist healthcare community was seeking that, and they haven't adopted it. The statements that on intimacy and relationships and sexuality and so on and so forth, one of the things I say in the paper is you get the sense reading them that the church thinks God needs to be defended.
That's right.
To what end? Our interpretation may need to be defended. And in that case, then let's have a robust conversation about it, but not a statement from above. I remain, again, naively optimistic that we are Protestant entities.
You know, when that statement got voted that you're talking about, I think that at least behind the scenes, there was a very clear kind of statement from the healthcare organizations to the administration.
Yeah.
This does not work.
No,
This
not helpful.
This does not function.
Not helpful.
And the response was, we're voting it
Yeah.
anyway. And so that disconnect between what they want as the public face, as opposed to what I'm saying is the lived reality of church. You know, it's the church trying to deal with divorce, you know, how many years ago, and thinking that speaking strongly against divorce is going to prevent divorce from happening. Well, I mean, we haven't talked about divorce in an awfully long time.
One of the ways churches change their belief structure is for the administrative branch. Again, I'm not internal to Catholicism, but I work in Catholicism, is for the church to just stop talking about it. Women's reproductive issues, contraception. According to the Guttmacher Institute, statistically, with that variance, you know, there's the, I'm not a statistician, all Catholic women use artificial contraception at some point in their life. And yet the sacerdotal structure that the dictates of the structure of the church insists that that is wrong.
Well, that's because it's all men.
Yes, yes, yes. And you'll note that one of the three things that I put in there that the healthcare corporations, faith-based corporations won't do is abortion. A woman must demonstrate, and Grace, tell me if I'm straying too far here. A woman must demonstrate, oftentimes to a panel of male physicians, including a chaplain, that there's some pathological reason maybe a psychological reason that might be considered for her to be justified to get an abortion in our facility. How is it that that's the case today? I just approved a contraceptive device for a patient at the hospital I work at. 62-year-old white man having to approve whether a woman gets an IUD placed. What in the world? And that's protected by our government for our faith-based healthcare. 1 in 7 people in this country seek care at a Catholic facility. If you add all the other faith traditions, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 4. And those moral convictions of the parent of the healthcare branch impose upon the public through the healthcare ministry. That's a very real problem.
We just have a few more minutes before we're going to take a 15-minute break. So I'd just like to emphasize this is very important and relevant. But again, we have Richard Rice and Jasper. So this is the last chance to ask any questions to either of them. You have a question?
Just a comment on Mark's thing about East and West in American reality, West Coast and medical, and I think a senior medical student at the time, and there was what we called it at that time, a sex change operation in the hospital. I think they called it gender reassignment. The grandson of one of the grand people in the history was doing the surgery, and his son was assisting, who later became dean of the School of Medicine. I don't want to give them away too much. But this
Kind of limits the people.
This was at the time cutting edge.
Yes.
This was not, something that's routine even in the US. But it was reality. This is what our reality was. This is the judgment that doctors have made. And I continue to make that. And so in some way we have a host of.
Yeah, that's the tension I was trying to refer to. Yeah.
Because some things are done. And maybe we should trust people who make that judgment.
Well, to illustrate it, again, in the Catholic system, famously in one of the hospitals in New York, often the hospitals historically were run by orders of nuns. And in this hospital, all of the women's reproductive care was offered in the women's bathroom because they knew that bishops would not go into the bathrooms.
How big are bathrooms?
Yeah, big enough, apparently. But it remains true that a local archbishop or bishop can reach in and tell a healthcare ministry, you must stop doing that. I've lived through this in my position, where a certain service line to the community was, we were told to stop doing it.
But the General Conference doesn't have that authority with Adventist healthcare.
Certainly not structurally, but there might be Adventist healthcare systems that would be bonded closely enough to say, we need to follow that direction.
So when that statement was made, that the one that Jerry was involved with, I was there when they voted that at the General Conference. Was the intention to twist the arm behind the back of the health system and say you've got to follow this? I saw it more as a statement to the membership to say that we're standing for right.
That may be true. Again, in terms of felt need, I think I've forgotten if it was Doug Batchelor or someone else, but they gave an impassioned appeal at the annual council saying, when I talk to people about our church's position, I'm embarrassed that we don't say that it's murder.
That was Doug.
Yeah. My gosh, murder? I don't know if he actually used that word or not, but please, my word, that is not helpful.
But he's allowed to. And this is the tension that, Last
Yeah.
comment.
So dialogue, back to
Yeah,
dialogue.
yeah.
Dialogue is difficult. Dialogue
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Which is why Niebuhr is so important.
This is why immoral society and moral man, we need to flip flops.
Yeah, yeah.
Every institution has men and women, with enough of them, that have immoral tendencies, and I have them, and institutions have them. This is why dialogue creates a lot of tension, but it also pushes back. The blindness seems to be evenly distributed across both coasts
Mhm.
and through the middle.
Mhm.
And so you kind of have to have that dialogical approach to try to
Yes.
figure out very complex issues.
Well-
And this would be my biggest concern with all is is ethics aiming for the natural? Or are they superimposing something on the natural? Most likely superimposing. The question is then, who is going to dictate what that imposing is? I
Sure.
think this is part of the battle, and this is
Sure.
part of the dialogical tension.
To be clear and to position myself, again, going back to the comment about whether a person is celibate or not. My position isn't that we throw all standards to the wind. My position is that humans need intimate relationships. And for the church to say, because you're that way, you can't be among us.
Or you can't be part of the dialogue. That's
Right.
yeah.
Now, you can choose to be done with intimacy of that sort, and now you will talk to you.
Thank you so much, Mark.